episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. Okay, so before we kick off with today's tasting, a little bit of news. This week I've been sorting out the tastings that we're going to be hosting in the shop over the next 12 months or so, and I believe they're all now up on the Gauntlet's website, so you can take a look, see what's coming up. Noticeable evenings, I think, will be in May. Jennifer from Casa Agave will be doing a tequila and mezcal tasting, obviously to coincide with the Cinco de Mayo celebrations of kicking French butt. I think that's going to be held on the 8th of May, which is the closest date to the 5th, because the 5th is the weekend. I've also lined up Shilton from Paul John, sometime in the summer. I forget whether it was the June or July tasting evening, but like I said, it's on the website, so you can check that one out. I'm also working on possibly getting Bricklady to do one of the evenings. That has yet to be confirmed, and then obviously all the rest will be yours truly and a selection of interesting spirits. We're also going to be doing a cognac and an Armagnac tasting, and I forget which date that one is, but I think that's an earlier in the year one, so hopefully that should be quite interesting as well. And I think we're going to do a sort of a random dark spirits evening towards the end of the year, so again that should be quite interesting. So there'll be a selection of different dark spirits, shall we say. Anyway, so that's a little bit of news. Like I said, the tickets unfortunately have had to go up a little bit, I think, due to obviously the increase in the cost of whiskey and what have you. So we've had to sort of implement a £5 ticket rise, so now 35 quid as opposed to 30, which I still think is pretty good value for money, and hopefully you guys will agree. And so for those of you that live in Nottingham and the surrounding area and that maybe haven't actually been to one of our tasting evenings, I would be quick, because they do sell out pretty quickly. I mean, I haven't actually advertised the January tasting evening, and that's all been sold out well before we'd even figured out what was going to be doing. So there's obviously, you know, quite a momentum, lots of people interested in these evenings. So like I said, if you are interested in coming along to one, be quick and get your name down and purchase tickets forthwith, as they say. Anyway, again, before we move on to today's episode of the show, I was looking back at an old episode from 4 years ago the other day and realised I think I've come quite a long way since that particular episode, which was, like I said, about 2014. I think the episodes of the show are now a bit more, shall we say, professional, but at least it was pretty funny anyway, and yeah, obviously aged, shall we say. But yeah, anyway, so if you haven't looked back at some of the older episodes, have a look at them, because some of them are quite amusing. And I remember somebody making a comment like, I've counted how many times you went and I'll try and avoid doing it as much these days, but you try talking for half an hour without pretty much a break, and you'll find out that you do and an awful lot. But anyway, try and keep it to a minute. So on to today's episode of the show. As you can see from the title page, we're looking at yet another selection from Gordon MacPhail. It's amazing, isn't it? You know, don't do an episode of the show on Gordon MacPhail for donkey's years, and suddenly two crop up practically back to back. Well, not back to back, I mean, I did one tail end of last year. And well, basically it's because Luke, the rep for Gordon MacPhail, popped into the shop and said, oh, I've got some samples here, you know, thought you might make use of them, by which he meant do an episode of the show. So here I am doing an episode of the show on those samples, and if any of the bigwigs from Gordon MacPhail are watching, yeah, man is doing a damn good job. So yes, I've got a selection. I did have 6 that he kind of gave me, but one was the old Glen Scotia that I used in the previous episode of the show. So I thought, well, do I just do the 5 or do I just shoehorn in a 6? And I have actually shoehorned in a 6th, which I just happen to have lying around. I had a few older bottlings in the Connoisseurs Choice range, so I've kind of shoehorned in one of their older Glen Elgins, and mainly because you don't really see an awful lot of Glen Elgin. I mean, it crops up from time to time in the independents, and it's also gave me an opportunity to kind of like show on the title page how different the current bottles actually are in design and shape and labelling and what have you, and I think they look pretty smart. So I think it was a good move, and the first time I can really remember that the MacPhails have actually had quite a radical redesign. Normally it was just the same tall round bottle but just a redesigned label, but this time they've you know, tail end of last year, or mid last year as the case may be, they decided to go for a full hog, as they say. So anyway, I guess that's enough waffle and umming and ahhing, and let's just take a look at today's Right, okay, so we're going to kick off with the aforementioned Glen Elgin. Now this is a 16-year-old, and the only reason I'm kind of kicking off with it is because it's bottled at 43%, whereas all the other samples in today's episode of the show come from their Connoisseurs Choice Cask Strength range, so they're all, funnily enough, cask strength. Anyway, so this was distilled in 1998, bottled in 2014. I don't think I've had it lying around here since 2014, but anyway, Glen Elgin is, certainly this particular bottling in the old Connoisseurs Choice range was a favourite of mine, so I think it's going to be a nice way to kick off the show. The next bottling we'll be looking at is a Highland Park. 12-year-old Highland Park, no less. Wonder how that's going to sort of stack up to the, shall we say, somewhat disappointing distillery bottling. So this was distilled in 2006, bottled in 2018. It's 12 years old, like I said, bottled at 56.3% and aged entirely in first fill bourbon oak. Okay, well, we'll give it a whirl, as they say. The second bottle we'll be looking at is in the MacPhail's Distillery Labels collection. This is an Ardmore. This was the Ardmore 1998. They seem to release quite a fair amount of it. 19 years old, so bottled in 2017, and aged in refill sherry hogsheads. Fourth bottle we'll be looking at is back to the cask strength bottlings. This is Glentauchers, distilled in 1991, bottled in 2018, 27 years old, 56.8%, and first fill sherry butts, as you can see from the colour. And as you can see from the colour on the next one, it is again another sherry matured whisky, and again another Highland Park. Ooh. Yeah, sharp intake of breath, but this was distilled in 1989 and is 29 years old, bottled at 57% and aged in refill sherry butts. And finally, nothing like finishing with a bit of peat, and indeed today we will be finishing with a bit of peat. This is a 17-year-old Caol, distilled in 2000, bottled in 2018 at 56.1% and aged in first fill bourbon barrels. So there you go, that's the lineup. Hopefully it should be interesting. So we're going to kick off with a bit okay, so let's start with Glen Elgin, 16 years old. Let's see what the nose gives us. It's a lovely nose. It's got quite a lot of maturity in actual fact. It certainly feels a lot older than the 16. It's got that lovely dusty barley, dusty American oak, touch of honey, sliver of citrus and minerality. It's got a really lovely balance. I mean, the minerality and the citric notes kind of go a little bit limey possibly, and really kind of scythe through all that sort of barley and honey and American oak, but not to where the point of austerity, shall we say. It just adds a really lovely balance. The oak is getting a little bit of tea leaf, possibly a little bit of coffee. But like I said, this was always one of my favourites in the sort of the Connoisseurs choice range, because it just seemed to be quite quite a lovely malt. But no, each bottling, it seemed to sort of like, you know, continue. You very rarely got a poor bottling of Glen Elgin in that particular range. They obviously had some pretty standout casks from that particular distillery. So anyway, let's see what the palate gives us. Luscious, lovely finish, really honeyed. It's such a lovely balanced malt. It kind of kicks off with that sort of slightly honeyed notes, barley, white fruit, apple, pear possibly. And then mid palate you get that lovely sort of cleansing minerality, that freshness, a little bit of lemon. And that kind of lingers through, right through into the finish, but there's plenty of weight of barley and fruit and honey to kind of again stop that finish being too austere, shall we say. And the balance is just absolutely sublime. The oak is slightly dusty, and I'm guessing you can probably still find this bottle in out and about. And if you can, and you like that kind of style of whiskey, which I absolutely love, I just love that sort of honeyed fruitiness and balanced minerality stroke citrus, really floats my boat. So yeah, great start. Right, okay, so let's move on to the 12-year-old Highland Park. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? It's clean, quite heathery, touch of honey, very aromatic, quite fruity in actual fact. I'm certainly not getting any of that sort of, you know, murky ick that you get with the Distillery 12-year-old. That was a technical term, by the way. The oak is starting to come through really quite strongly. It is obvious first fill American oak. It's got that kind of very bourbony kind of character, a little bit of almost kind of rye-like herbal notes as well. But on the whole, I think that's pretty well balanced in actual fact. I mean, hasn't got huge coastal character, so I'm guessing that this was probably a new fill that MacPhail's purchased and aged in their warehouses on the mainland. But it has a lovely fruitiness, and you know, that is actually a really quite impressive Highland Park, it has to be said. Proof that they can distill good spirit, you know. All the more reason it makes you wonder what the hell goes wrong, certainly with the Distillery 12-year-old. But anyway, well, we know what goes wrong, but let's see what the palate's like. Very oaky, very gritty, lots of vanilla, not as fruity, not as exuberant, a bit of salt on the finish. That sort of elevated alcohol and saltiness really does make the finish a little bit austere. I'm going to put a little bit of water with it and see what happens. It's a bit sort of, it's a bit too much oak on the palate, and I think if the palate had kind of replicated the sort of the aromatic quality of the nose, I think I would have been enthusing about it. I mean, it's not bad at all, not bad at all, but it's just that oak is just far too aggressive on the palate. Let's see what happens now. We put a bit of water with it. More barley, more heathery notes, less oak, and it's got sweeter as well. Not quite so aromatic, it has to be said, because it's more barley focused now. But still, that is a lovely nose. Let's see what the barrel's like now. Quite mouth-filling, not quite so salty, not quite so gritty and overtly oaky, a little bit better balanced. It's a bit straightforward. Nothing really kind of stands out about the palate apart from it. It's pleasant. Again, slightly heathery, slightly honeyed, more secondary oak kind of characters now, sort of a little bit of coffee, a little bit of toffee, less grit, less tannins. I think the balance is slightly better with a drop of water, and I think overall, I think you have to say that that's actually quite a pleasant Highland Park, or should I say, quite a pleasant young Highland Park, or relatively young. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Ardmore. Now, for most of you know, Ardmore tends to make quite a heavily peated malt, so you would expect it to be further along in the tasting, but there is an obvious reason why it isn't. So let's see what the nose gives us. Not the heaviest of peated Ardmores I've ever come across, it has to be said, which is why it's this early on in the tasting. There's a bit of peat, there's a bit of peat dust. The sherry is quite subtle. There's a subtle dried fruit note to it. There's a touch of tea leaf. It's okay. It's probably not the greatest bottling of Ardmore that I think MacPhail's have ever released, it has to be said. And I have noticed that their distillery label bottlings have been a bit hit and miss. I have tasted some that have been absolutely fantastic and some that have been okay. You know, I mean, I've not tasted a crap bottling, but I mean, it's got a nice depth to it. It's, like I said, it's not overly peaty, so it's not going to sort of take your head off with that. And it's got a good richness, a good subtlety of sherry notes. It's not OTT on the sherry. There's a little bit of barley underneath. Yeah, it's perfectly acceptable. Anyway, let's see what the palate's like now. Softer, creamier, fuller, a little bit more barley, a little bit more vanillins. Again, not particularly peaty. There's a sort of a little bit on the middle. There's a slight, almost metallic twang to the finish. A little bit of spice. Dried sherry fruit really only kind of comes through on the finish. Again, it's okay. I don't know what that's going to retail for. I would guess probably in the 80s, and I'd be a bit nonplussed about it, it has to be said. Nothing wrong with it, and again, like I said, not exactly the most heaviest of peated Ardmores I've ever come across. Yeah, it's okay. Right, let's venture on to the Glentauchers. So this is 100% first fill sherry. Distillery character? Well, let's see. Quite treacly, soft, herbal, oloroso, tar. It's almost got a sort of a peated feeling to it, but it's not quite. It's kind of sort of somewhere between sort of quite earthy and starting to become a little bit peaty. It's interesting. There's raisins, licorice, walnut, prune. I mean, yeah, okay, it's very clean, there's no sulphur, I'm not getting the, I mean, there's a bit of granity mineraliness, but not as much as you would normally expect with Glentauchers, but then obviously the sherry cask is kind of blunting that to a certain extent. Yeah, it gets quite herbal as with time. I mean, again, it is what it is, I suppose. I mean, it's 27 years old, but there is a bit of maturity. There is a bit of that sort of sub-Armagnac-y kind of character going on, but it's kind of, it's not really showing that sort of maturity that you would expect with something almost close to 30 years old. I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad whiskey. It just seems to be a sort of a bit like Cliff Richard, not really showing its age. Well, he may well be now, to be honest with you. But anyway, let's see what Pat's like. Quite chewy on the finish, quite malty. Again, pretty much dominated by the sherry characters. You've got prunes, dates, almonds, walnuts, raisins. The finish has that kind of Glentauchers kind of minerality, and quite spicy in actual fact. The kind of the sort of the minerality and the alcohol level. 56.8 really does kind of emphasise those kind of spices on the finish, and they're really dancing on the tongue. I mean, it's a lovely whiskey, it has to be said. If you like sort of like big sherried whiskies, I'm not really getting a great deal of character, other than, like I said, the sort of the kind of classic Glentauchers minerality. I'm going to put a little drop of water with it. I don't think it's going to make a huge amount of difference, but we shall see if it sort of softens the sherry impact a little bit. It's a little bit lighter. It's still quite sherried. There's still all of that sort of, you know, sub-Armagnac-y kind of dried fruits. A little bit more aromatic. There's possibly a smidge of a heather maybe, or something of that kind of ilk. Let's see what Pat's like now. Ooh, yeah, that's brought out the bitterness and the oak, I can tell you that for a start. A bit of a shock to the system. I mean, yes, there's plenty of that kind of treacly dried fruits to sort of stop it being overly sort of bitter and grabbing you by the nads, but by God, it does still. The bitterness is actually quite fleeting, because it kind of like, you know, you pretty much grabs you right as you sort of right at the beginning, and then sort of tails off, and you get the sort of like the dried fruits and what have you kind of coming through on the finish. It's entertaining, it has to be said. I mean, you know, it's but certainly not one-dimensional. It's certainly got some interest. Whether there's a great deal of distillery character, of course, obviously you're not going to expect that with first fill sherry, but it's a bit of fun, should we say. But I mean, I don't know what it's going to retail for, but ain't going to be cheap. But you know, again, it's, you know, if you like that sort of style, then yeah, why not? Right, okay, and talking of not cheap, because I can't imagine the 29-year-old Highland Park is going to be cheap. I mean, this is going to be comfortably 3 figures. So let's have a look and see if it's worth it. clean, no sulphur, so that's a good starter. Quite herbal, with that sort of mixture of heather and herbal oloroso. Again, I think I would struggle to sort of say, if I tasted this blind, to sort of say, yes, this is Highland Park. The sherry is again quite dominant, although it is refill sherry. It's got some lovely maturity, you know, the sort of classic sort of Armagnac-y kind of dark malty sort of dried fruits kind of character. A little bit of salt, a little bit of orange conserve coming through now. A little bit of smoke as well, just a smidgen of peat. I mean, yeah, that's it. Again, it's a pleasant nose, but it's sort of like, you know, I'm not getting any distillery character really. It is kind of pretty much again all about the cask, and although the cask is very, well, you know, very clean, and you can't, there's no sulphur, there's no fust and all that kind of stuff, it does leave me feeling a little bit underwhelmed. But then that's me and sherry. It's just the way it is. Let's see what the power's like now. Lovely length, it has to be said. Very unctuous, loads of dried fruit, very silky, a little bit of treacle, tar, touch of smoke. I mean, it's an impressive palate. I mean, if you just ignore the fact that it's Highland Park. I don't mean that in a detrimental way. I mean the fact is that if you just sort of look at it as a sherry cask whisky of reasonable age, it kind of hits all the right buttons. It's very soft. It's got there's a touch of tobacco on the finish, a little bit of spice, touch of salt. I mean, it's a lovely whisky, but it really doesn't say Highland Park to me. It just says a possibly coastal influenced sherry cask whisky. And you know, as I keep saying, if you love that kind of whisky, then you're just going to love it. You know, if like me, I don't mind sherry cask whiskies, but you know, it's sort of like, it's all relative, isn't it? You know, it's a case of it's just that little slightly too imbalanced, because it's too much sherry and not enough of anything else other than a bit of coastal character and a bit of heather, I suppose. You know, maybe I'm doing it a disservice. I mean, you know, but if I'm spending 3 figures on a bottle of whiskey, I really want to be impressed by it. I want it to sort of like, you know, give me something more than just, oh, I can taste the cask. And the same thing, as I've said countless times, goes for, you know, first fill American oak. You know, so sometimes that can just be too OTT, too much oak, and again sort of masking any kind of spirit character. And for me, again, it just seems it can come across as yet another whiskey aged in first fill American oak. But anyway, kind of coming back to that, I don't think it needs a drop of water. I mean, even though it is actually 57%, okay, I'll put a drop of water with it and just see what happens. Again, I don't really expect it to make a great deal of difference. But anyway, let's have a look. Actually, I'm getting more kind of aromatic barley now, it has to be said. The sort of the sherry has been kind of pushed down a bit, and it's got that sort of slightly summery kind of feel to it. Again, the sherry is actually quite pleasant because it's now relegated to the background. It's adding a little bit more maturity. I'm getting more age now. Yeah, actually, I'm actually quite warming to this nose now. I've put a little drop of water with it. See what the palate's like now. It's okay. I mean, it's the water has kind of simplified everything. It hasn't really brought out any barley or any citrus or any other kind of characters other than just kind of taking the salty edginess and alcohol edge off the palate. It's all now quite soft, it's quite laid back, it's quite pleasant, it's nice, it's, again, it's not exciting. I'm not in raptures about it. It's just sort of like, yeah, okay, it's okay. It's another one of those sort of whiskies that sort of fall into the sort of the morass, shall we say. Because people often say to me, how do you remember all these whiskies? And I say, well, I remember the really very, very good ones, and I remember the bloody awful ones, and then you have this middle ground, which a lot of whiskies kind of fall into, that you don't remember because they're just sort of like, okay. And I'm afraid this one just kind of falls into that kind of middle ground for me anyway. But quality wise, I certainly couldn't knock it. But yeah, it's not kind of floating my longboat, shall we say. Okay, so let's move on to the Caol. So 17 years old and first fill bourbon. Let's see what the nose gives us. It's full, it's quite oily, it's very sort of modern style Caol. It's got a lovely brininess. There's quite a lot of coastal character. There's some lovely apricot, there's a bit of apple. There's a little bit of medicinal notes. It's not hugely peated. The peat is kind of in the background. There's a bit of bog myrtle, iodine. Gets a little bit more salty as it kind of sits in the glass. It's sort of getting a little bit more coastal. And you're not getting a huge amount of oak. The oak is very, very well behaved considering this is first fill bourbon. It's kind of adding more to the sort of the kind of structure of the malt. It's kind of bolstering the slightly oily, fuller character of modern day Caol. You know what? I really quite like this. I think this is absolutely gorgeous. Let's see what the palate's like. Quite chewy, quite malty, coal dust, peat dust, certainly on the finish. It kind of opens up more, touch more oak. It's more rounded, there's a bit more vanilla. Yeah, that's actually quite fleeting because then in comes a bit of citrus, in comes a bit of peat, in comes a bit of salt, and sort of, so the oak is kind of like, not actually dominating the palate at all. It kind of like kicks off and you get the impression that it's going to be very, very oaky, and then suddenly the sort of spirit just kind of comes in and goes, nope, we're in control now. And it's almost mouth-watering finish, really, really salty. But underneath it all is that kind of classic sort of rich, slightly oily Caol fruit, barley. I mean, and this is one of the lovely things about Caol. A lot of people just overlook Caol completely. They, what they think of Islers, they want to go Ardbeg or Lagavulin or what have you, and they just don't think about Caol. And it's because it just doesn't really have, I think, the sort of the cachet or profile of maybe the other Isla distilleries. It just kind of goes about its job in a completely sort of unassuming way and produces great whiskey of varying peating levels, and there's a lot of it about, and you see a lot of it in the independent sector, and probably don't need a drop of water, but I'm probably going to put a little drop of water just for the hell of it, just to see what happens more than anything else, I suppose. Now we're getting more oak. It's just one of these things, isn't it? It's sort of how certain whiskies you put a little drop of water with it and the oak kind of like disappears, and other whiskies you put a little drop of water and the oak suddenly explodes out, and I'm getting a lot more vanilla and a lot more almost toffee kind of notes, and kind of also brought out the salt, but the peat has dropped off a bit, which often tends to be the case. More barley. Still lovely, really lovely nose, it has to be said. So it pass on now. Sweeter, more barley, more sweeter vanillins, still quite oily, a little bit short, touch of salt. Violety finish now. I'm getting that kind of, you know, lovely sort of almost kind of Bamori kind of violets on the finish. And you know what, I think it's one of these sort of whiskies that's really enjoyable with or without water. It does quite change its character considerably when you put a little drop of water with it, but you get all these different characters. It's just sort of like completely different malt. Still quite salty on the aftertaste, and again not as peaty as it is when it's neat, but that often happens when you sort of like dilute cask strength peated malts. But it's more a kind of mouth coating feeling. You sort of like, you know, the oiliness and the peat just kind of coats the mouth and sort of stays there, and it's sort of like, you know, just lingers, and it's a sort of whiskey that you can probably taste several minutes after you know actually had a mouthful of it, and I like that. That's a lovely way to finish. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show up. I think, again, although this is just a very small snapshot of the MacPhail's range, it goes to show that, you know, some of the stuff that MacPhail's are bottling is quality-wise very, very good. It's a shame that, I don't even know. See, the thing is, I'm still confused about the whole bloody, what they've done to their range with their sort of batch bottlings and what have you. I don't even know if they do a bloody Glen Elgin anymore. I assume they probably do, but that like I said was always one of my favourites from the old Connoisseurs choice range, and certainly still very, very good. 12-year-old Highland Park, yeah, okay, loved the nose, great nose, really, really like that. Palate less enthused about. Quality very, very good. Beats the Distillery bottling absolutely hands down. It has to be said, alright, yes, I know the Distillery 12-year-old is not a cask strength bottling, but quality wise, with a little drop of water, still absolutely hammered it. Ardmore, yeah, okay, can't argue with the quality. Not the greatest Ardmore that I've ever tasted the MacPhail's have bottled. Has to be said, there have been better bottlings, or should I say more interesting bottlings, but even so, I still think that's, yeah, not a bad bottling. The Glentauchers, well, yeah, again, I suppose the sort of same scenario. Quality is pretty good, no sulphur, you know, good quality casks, but in the end of the day, just not a particularly exciting whiskey unless sort of like, you know, you really get off on sherried whiskies. Yes, it had that sort of Glentauchers kind of, you know, minerality, but just not enough distillery character. The Highland Park, 29-year-old. I'm torn about that one, it has to be said. Yes, I think I preferred it when I put a little drop of water with it, and it certainly did show a little bit more character, but even so, it was just sort of like, you know, neat, another kind of sherried whiskey, albeit a coastal sherried whiskey, and you're paying sort of like through the nose for it, you know. I don't know, I kind of leave you lot to make your mind up about that one, but to me, it's not one that I would sort of go, yeah, I've got to have that one on the shelf, shall we say. And the Connoisseur's Choice Caol, yeah, lovely Caol, modern style Caol, oily, and like I said, I think it sort of worked either with or without water quite nicely, so yeah. So, yes, big thank you to MacPhail's for the samples for this week's episode of the show. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you'll tune into next week's episode show, which I think is going to be very, very interesting. Not that I'm saying that this week's episode of the show wasn't interesting, but next week's episode of the show will feature a couple of bottlings that are not actually over here yet, and I've got my hands on some samples. Yes, well, I'll keep you guessing about that one. So until next week, good dramming and good afternoon.
All this time, you have been living like you own your own time, like you have that control.